On May 2, 1945, newspapers around the world announced one of the most awaited pieces of news. Berlin had surrendered to Soviet forces. This event was a clear indication that the Third Reich was collapsing, and the defeat of the Axis powers was imminent. Within days, German forces unconditionally surrendered both in the West on May 7th and in the East on May 9th. As a result, May 8th was proclaimed Victory in Europe Day, bringing an end to one of the most terrifying dictatorships in history. That is the official version we know, the narrative that we celebrate and study year after year. But what would have happened if that surrender had never occurred? What kind of world would we have inherited if the forces of the Third Reich had prevailed? If the red and black flag of Nazi Germany had flown triumphantly across the European continent, how would the world's destiny have changed? This is a scenario that has fascinated and puzzled historians for decades. To imagine what the world would be like today if Adolf Hitler and his totalitarian regime had won the war, we must go back to a key point in history and ask ourselves, what would have happened if the course of events had been different? How would the world order have been reconfigured under the shadow of the Third Reich? April 1945, the unexpected resurrection of the Reich in Berlin. In April 1945, the streets of Berlin, overwhelmed by desolation and chaos, witnessed a miraculous turn of events in the war that could have changed Europe's fate. After months of constant attacks, bombings, and the unstoppable advance of the Red Army towards the capital of the Third Reich, something unthinkable happens. The German forces, on the brink of annihilation, seem to rise from the ashes. On April 1st, after weeks of fierce resistance, the Wehrmacht troops, driven by desperation and a last wave of secret supplies, managed to repel a key Soviet advance on the outskirts of Berlin. What had been a field of ruins in the days before now becomes a battlefield where the German soldiers, overwhelmed and malnourished, begin to gain ground. The Soviets, although superior in numbers and equipment, suffer significant casualties due to the unexpected counterattacks. This unforeseen setback becomes an opportunity for the Germans to take the offensive, just as everything seemed lost. The situation is dramatic. The Luftwaffe, almost destroyed, rises with what is left of its forces. The German war machine, which still has secret weapons in development, such as the V-2 rockets and jet aircraft prototypes, is used desperately to launch strategic attacks that delay the Soviet advance. In the heart of Berlin, the situation is even more surreal. As the city is besieged by the Red Army, the Reich's leadership, who had already lost hope of victory, now faces an odd possibility. The Führer, who months earlier had fallen into a deep state of depression, begins to revive with the news of the resurgence of German forces. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler, having recovered from his personal crisis, begins to devise new plans. At his command, improvised units made up of older men, young members of the Hitler Youth, and women who had never seen the front lines are mobilized. These civilians, organized in an ad hoc manner, are thrown into battle in a desperate effort to save the homeland, fighting not only against the Soviets but also against the demoralization and hunger that plague them. On April 6th, the Germans achieve a victory in a small sector of the city, which causes a significant shift in the morale of the troops. Although resources are minimal, the psychology of war begins to tilt in favor of Berlin's defenders. Goebbels' propaganda is reignited with renewed energy, spreading the message that the Reich's resistance was not only possible, but that Aryan supremacy could still prevail. The rest of Europe, upon hearing news of these advances, begins to question whether the Allies can truly end the conflict in the short term. On the other hand, the situation of the Soviets begins to grow critical. The Red Army, although larger and better equipped, suffers severe losses due to German ambushes and the unconventional war tactics of the new improvised units. While the German resistance cannot completely stop the Soviet advance, it manages to slow it considerably, buying precious time. This setback forces Stalin to redirect part of his forces to the Eastern Front, delaying the final fall of Berlin. In Moscow, the news of German victories causes uncertainty and distrust among the high command of the Red Army, who had never faced such a fierce reaction since the early days of the war. In this context, the possibility that the Third Reich could survive becomes more real. Hitler, revitalized and confident, intensifies efforts to dismantle the Soviet apparatus, even receiving help from dissident factions in Eastern Europe, where resistance against the Soviet regime is gaining strength. Nazi-occupied Europe, despite its suffering, begins to look at the future under the Reich's control with new eyes, while German divisions in the east prepare for a second assault. As the spring of 1945 advances, the Third Reich seems to be experiencing what many would consider a miracle. On April 9th, the last remnants of the Red Army are forced to retreat, and Berlin, still under siege, resists once again. Hitler, knowing that the moment of his victory has arrived, does not hesitate to reaffirm his power over a devastated continent. In his mind, the old dream of Europe, dominated by the Reich, is closer than ever. The failure of the Allies in Normandy and its consequences, the collapse of the Western Offensive. On June 6, 1944, the Allies carried out one of the most ambitious landings in military history, Operation Overlord, aimed at liberating Europe from Nazi control by invading Normandy. The French coast became the setting for one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. However, what began as a bold and grand attack to open a second front in Europe quickly turned into a military disaster that could have changed the war's outcome. As American, British, Canadian, and French soldiers took the beach, the German resistance was much fiercer than expected. Despite suffering heavy losses in the first days of the landing, the Allies managed to establish a foothold in European territory, but the situation soon began to turn desperate. The lack of supplies, the slow pace of advances, and the constant harassment from German forces significantly delayed penetration into the interior of France. What seemed like a swift offensive turned into a bloody struggle for every town and every kilometer gained. By the end of 1944, the Allies were facing an unprecedented logistical chaos. Communication lines were severely compromised by constant Luftwaffe attacks and German ground forces. In the skies over Normandy, the German Air Force, although diminished, managed to resist the advance of Allied fighters, while on the ground, Wehrmacht forces, reinforced by new elite units and heavy equipment, stopped any attempt at a rapid advance. In fact, the famous supply route that had been established to supply the Allied forces was constantly interrupted, severely affecting the morale and effectiveness of the soldiers. The situation reached its critical point at the end of November 1944. As the Allies tried to advance toward the heart of France, they realized that casualties were rising rapidly, and reserves of fuel and ammunition were running low. In the Western Front, a deadly trap had been set. A huge mass of Allied troops, trapped in a logistical encirclement, fighting in the dark for every grain of food, every bullet, and every piece of essential equipment for their survival. Allied commanders, baffled, desperately tried to reorganize their lines, but the lack of air support and the constant harassment from German forces prevented them from advancing. In Washington and London, news of the situation was met with a mixture of horror and despair. Operation Overlord, which had been conceived as the beginning of the end of the Reich, now seemed poised to become a catastrophe. Millions of men and thousands of tons of war material were in danger of being annihilated in the heart of Europe, trapped between the sea and the Nazi army. There was no clear solution, and casualties on the Western Front were increasing at an alarming rate. Without the ability to regain control of the situation, the Allies could only hope for a miracle to avoid a defeat that would change the course of the war. Meanwhile, the Third Reich, which had fought against all odds in the East with Soviet resistance, was now strengthened by this unexpected reprieve. The German victory in Normandy not only delayed the fall of Berlin, but also allowed the Third Reich to reorganize, reinforcing its defense lines on the eastern and southern fronts. German forces, which on many fronts had already been on the defensive, found a new opportunity to consolidate their positions. By the end of 1944, the war was in a state of total uncertainty. In the east, Soviet forces continued pressing toward the heart of Germany, but the German resistance on the Western Front had proven to be more formidable than expected. The success of Operation Overlord had turned into a fragile dream of liberation, with the Allies fighting against time to avoid total disaster. The situation in France, Vichy collaborationist and the opportunity for Germany. As German troops advanced through French territory following the failure of the Allies in Normandy, France finds itself at the mercy of the forces of the Third Reich. Without the help of Allied powers, the country falls quickly into the hands of the Nazi war machine. This lightning-fast advance not only gives them a crucial tactical advantage, but also allows them to re-establish their supply lines, reinforce their forces with new recruits, and secure key territories. In this scenario, the collaborationist Vichy government, under Marshal Petain's leadership, plays a crucial role in consolidating the German victory. Since its establishment in 1940, Vichy has been a comfortable ally of Berlin, providing essential resources such as food, industrial materials, and forced labor for Nazi factories. Now, with the imminent defeat of the Allies on the Western Front, the Vichy regime becomes a key player in Hitler's domination of Western Europe. France, like other conquered countries, lives under the yoke of Nazi occupation, but the active collaboration of Vichy facilitates the exploitation of the country without having to fight directly against its own citizens. Vichy's collaboration, initially presented as a necessary evil to avoid total destruction, becomes even more evident as the conflict continues. Pétain's regime, with no hope of restoring the Republic, becomes a puppet of the Reich, ensuring the delivery of resources and political support while the French people, torn by the occupation, face increasing repression and suffering. As the Third Reich consolidates its control over France, Hitler's next target becomes clear. It is not merely about marching through the streets of Paris or posing again in front of the Eiffel Tower, but about directly attacking the heart of the Allies, the United Kingdom. The Luftwaffe's failure to defeat the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940 had not stopped Hitler. Now, with France under control, the plan for a direct invasion of the UK, known as Operation Sea Lion, Unternehmensseelöwe, becomes more realistic than ever. The proximity of the French coastline to England provides the Wehrmacht with an ideal launching pad for a massive invasion. This offensive would have a gigantic human and material cost, but the stakes are too tempting for Hitler to pass up. Simply getting close to England's shores, and potentially capturing it, would allow the Nazis to demand an armistice that would end the conflict in Europe on much more favorable terms for Berlin. Not only would it imply the surrender of the United Kingdom, but also the consolidation of Nazi supremacy on the European continent. Throughout 1945, the German forces prepare for this massive invasion. The planned landing on the British shores becomes a constant threat as the Wehrmacht accumulates resources in the coastal regions of France and Belgium. The threat of Sea Lion is the last card the Nazis can play to ensure their total dominance over Europe, a dominance that would stretch from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. As news of the German advances in Western Europe spreads, social pressure in the Allied powers begins to grow. War fatigue becomes a widespread sentiment in countries that have been fighting since 1939. The families of dead soldiers, economic hardships, and the constant threat of defeat lead the people to demand an end to the conflict. In the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and France, public opinion becomes a decisive factor for political leaders. The human and material sacrifices that the Allies have made over the years no longer seem to justify a war that keeps dragging on. As the Allies fight on multiple fronts, their resources deplete and the morale of the population diminishes. In Washington, London, and Moscow, governments are increasingly overwhelmed by growing social unrest. Strikes, protests, and manifestations of exhaustion multiply, while soldier casualties continue to rise. This environment of desperation and surrender is reflected in the attitude of the leaders of the Allied countries. As the situation becomes untenable, representatives of the major powers begin to consider the possibility of an armistice with Germany. Hitler, noticing this shift in the balance of power, uses the imminent threat of Operation Sea Lion and his victory in Normandy as leverage to pressure the Allied leaders. In a dramatic turn, social pressure, combined with the Allies' inability to achieve a decisive victory, finally leads to an armistice between the Western powers and the Third Reich. This negotiated surrender marks the end of World War II, but under very different terms than those taught by traditional history. In this alternative scenario, Hitler wins, securing the continuation of the Third Reich, and Europe falls under Nazi domination for generations. This armistice, which ends the conflict on the Western Front, allows Germany to consolidate its dominance over much of Europe, including France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and beyond. With Allied pressure broken and Nazi supremacy established, The future of the continent is sealed under the yoke of the Third Reich, while the exhausted and defeated Allied powers are forced to live under the shadow of a new world order. Consequences of a German victory, a new world order. What we have just described may seem like a nightmare, but it is one of the most terrifying possibilities in this hypothetical exercise. Had the Third Reich prevailed in World War II, the consequences for humanity would have been profound, beginning with a complete reconfiguration of global power. In a world where the Axis powers are victorious, the structure of international power would have been completely altered. The defeat of the Third Reich in 1945 represented not only the collapse of one of the most terrifying dictatorships in history, but also the end of a European imperialist system that had dominated the preceding centuries. The arrival of the Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as superpowers, was a direct result of the Axis defeat. However, had Hitler won, this reconfiguration would not have occurred. Under Nazi Germany's dominance, the old structure of imperial powers would have become obsolete. Powers like France and the United Kingdom, which were still dominant global actors at the start of the 20th century, would have been reduced to mere secondary players in a world controlled by the Reich. Germany would not only have consolidated its control over Europe, but it would have emerged as the primary global power, with its tentacles extending across continents. While emerging powers such as the United States, the USSR and China would play a role in this new order, they would remain in the shadow of Nazi Germany. Berlin's military power, reinforced by decades of technological and territorial supremacy, would have made any challenge quickly crushed. Nazi Germany would have consolidated its position as the great power of the 20th century and beyond, preventing any reconfiguration that might have given rise to a multipolar world. Science and technology under Nazi rule. One of the most fascinating aspects of a German victory is the impact it would have had on scientific and technological development. During World War II, Germany was already at the forefront in various fields, from nuclear physics to missile technology. If the Third Reich had won, these advances would not only have multiplied, but would also have been used to further consolidate Germany's power. The case of the German scientists captured by the United States at the end of the war is well known. Through Operation Paperclip, thousands of German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to work for the Americans on nuclear and space projects. This effort, among others, was key to the technological leadership of the United States during the Cold War. However, in an alternative scenario where the Axis emerged victorious, these scientific advances would not have been shared among rival powers, but would have remained in German hands. A German atomic bomb is not mere speculation. With Europe's resources under its control and scientific advancements accelerated by the war, it is highly likely that the Nazis would have developed their own nuclear weapons, possibly with the swastika as the symbol instead of the American flag. German nuclear power could have altered not only the military balance, but also the global political equilibrium. In the space sector, the Third Reich would not have lagged behind. With an already advanced war industry and a growing scientific infrastructure, Germany could have launched its own space program in the mid-20th century, putting satellites into orbit well before the United States or the Soviet Union. In fact, German astronautics and missile technologies could have been the precursors to technological advancements that, in real history, led to space exploration. The advancement of submarine technology would also have continued unchecked. The U-boats, already a formidable threat to Allied forces, would have received numerous upgrades. New generations of German submarines could have dominated the oceans, making any attempts at economic or military blockade against the Reich nearly impossible. The Holocaust, unchecked, horrors without external witnesses. If the Third Reich had triumphed, the horrors of the Holocaust would not only have continued, but would have reached even more apocalyptic dimensions. Without the intervention of the Allied forces and without the liberation of concentration and extermination camps, the genocide of Jews, Romani people, individuals with disabilities, and other groups considered undesirable would have been carried to its final consequences, with a global reach unprecedented in history. Under Hitler's regime, the systematic extermination of racial and ethnic minorities would have continued unabated, with concentration camps transforming into death factories on an industrial scale. The lack of foreign intervention would have allowed the execution of plans like the final solution, with the elimination of millions of people, mostly Jews, who would have had no escape. Extermination policies would have intensified, with the Nazis relentlessly pursuing those who did not conform to their ideologies of racial purity, without any external breaks to expose or stop the barbarity. In this dystopian world, global knowledge of the Holocaust would have been practically non-existent. International witnesses such as Allied soldiers, journalists, and human rights organizations would never have existed in this scenario to document and expose the magnitude of the atrocities. What we now know as one of the greatest crimes in human history would likely have remained a dark secret, hidden behind the Iron Curtain of Nazi propaganda. Racist values legitimized and no Nuremberg trials. In a world where Germany emerged victorious, the racist values of Nazism would not only have endured, but would have been legitimized and championed in many countries across Europe. The ideology of the Third Reich, centered on Aryan supremacy and the extermination or subjugation of inferior races, would have found fertile ground in nations such as Italy, France, Hungary, Croatia, and Romania, which already shared anti-Semitic and racist sentiments. The creation of a new European order under Berlin's leadership would have encouraged the adoption of similar policies in other countries, where collaboration with the Nazi regime would have not only been a matter of survival, but an accepted ideological choice. In countries like Croatia or Österreich, Austria, collaboration with the Nazis and the implementation of extermination programs, such as the killing of Jews, Romani people, and other groups, had already been present during German occupation. Without the defeat of Nazi Germany, these methods would have been normalized and extended, possibly even becoming official policies in many of these countries. Furthermore, the lack of a defeat for the Third Reich would have meant that there would have been no Nuremberg trials or any other form of international justice. Those responsible for war crimes, atrocities against humanity, and mass executions would have gone unpunished. The world, rather than learning from the barbarity of Nazism, would likely have witnessed the normalization of these crimes in international treaties, with a denial of responsibility for the genocides that marked one of the darkest periods of history. Without trials, without convictions, and without the visibility that later history has granted us, the Holocaust might simply have been another of the atrocities that characterized the 20th century, without the moral and legal weight that the term now carries. Cultural and linguistic changes. Germany as a European example. In a scenario where the Third Reich not only won the war but also established lasting dominance over all of Europe, cultural and linguistic changes would be drastic. In order to consolidate its supremacy, it is highly likely that Germany would not only maintain political control, but would impose its language, customs, and values on the other European peoples. German would have become the universal language of diplomacy, business, and education. The Reich would not limit itself to imposing its language, but would restructure societies within an authoritarian and fascist framework, with absolute control over the culture and national identity of the occupied countries. Nazi totalitarian ideas would permeate every aspect of social life, from education to artistic expression. Any form of intellectual or artistic resistance deviating from the regime's imposed values would be suppressed, and artists, philosophers, and intellectuals who opposed it would be persecuted. In this context, a large portion of Europe's intellectuals, artists, and scientists, particularly those with progressive ideas, would likely have been forced to emigrate to the Americas, seeking refuge in countries like the United States or in Latin America. This would have created an even greater cultural polarization, with Europe under the boot of Nazism and the Western world increasingly distancing itself from democratic and humanist values. Cinema, literature, and art would have aligned with the regime's propaganda, glorifying Adolf Hitler's figure and the ideology of National Socialism. Only representations that exalted war, Aryan supremacy, and the extermination of the undesirables would have been allowed. European culture would have been irrevocably deformed under the shadow of totalitarianism, with no possibility of recovery or free expression. False democracy in France and the United Kingdom under German control. In the case of a German victory, Nazi Germany's influence would quickly spread across Europe, and defeated powers such as France and the United Kingdom would be forced to live under a Nazi-controlled regime, albeit with a facade of autonomy to avoid popular resistance and internal pressures. France, which had been partially occupied during much of the war, would likely remain a puppet state of Berlin, though with certain appearances of a controlled democracy. The United Kingdom, having not been directly invaded, might have been treated similarly, with a collaborationist regime, but without completely losing its national identity. Although on the surface these countries might have maintained a parliamentary or electoral system, their democracy would have been entirely fake. The leaders of these countries would have been nothing more than puppets of the Nazi machinery. They would have been forced to follow Berlin's directives in nearly every aspect. Policies would be dictated from the heart of the Third Reich, ensuring that, even though the country might have had superficial democratic institutions, crucial decisions would rest solely in the hands of Hitler and his closest circle. France, in particular, might have been organized as a zone of influence, with a puppet government promoting Nazi ideology and forcing the population to adapt to new laws, restrictions, and racial norms imposed by the occupiers. The Nazis, as they did in other regions, would have sought to restructure society according to their own interests, eliminating resistance, re-educating the population, and assimilating or eliminating ethnic and religious minorities considered undesirable. On the other hand, the United Kingdom, remaining partially free due to its geographic location, could have served as a kind of neutral zone, but still under the constant threat of invasion or a government indirectly controlled by Berlin. Social, political, and economic tensions would likely have intensified as the British population witnessed the growing oppression in neighbouring countries like France and Belgium and the imposition of a totalitarian system across the continent. This controlled government would not only serve Nazi interests, but would also allow Hitler to consolidate his occupied territories and continue exploiting resources, forced labour, and other economic and strategic advantages that these countries could offer. A German victory would have allowed these occupation and control systems to persist for decades, always under the facade of an order and prosperity imposed by the Third Reich. The Soviet Union, a special case, and the division of Europe. The situation with the Soviet Union in this hypothetical scenario would undoubtedly be one of the most complex. Although the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was initially successful in many areas, Russia still presented formidable resistance, with almost infinite human and territorial resources. Despite the massive devastation the war would have caused, Stalin and his regime would likely not have surrendered without offering resistance. In a scenario where Germany emerges victorious, it is possible that the Soviet Union would not have fallen completely under Nazi control, but would have lost much of its influence. The division of Europe would be one of the most significant consequences of this victory. The continent would be brutally divided between a gigantic Germany, which would dominate all of Western Europe and part of Eastern Europe, and a weakened and isolated Russia, which could maintain control over a large portion of its territory, thanks to its resources and vast army. It is likely that Hitler would have tried to negotiate some kind of pact with the Soviets, in which certain borders would be respected but in a nearly symbolic way. This would lead to the creation of a polarized Europe, where the Nazis would militarily and politically control the western part, while the Soviet bloc, weakened and isolated, would be reduced mainly to Asian Russia and a few neighboring republics. However, conflict between both blocs would likely have been inevitable, as ideological and territorial tensions would have remained constant. Regarding nuclear war, given the scale of destruction during World War II, it is possible that the conflict between these two major blocs would have escalated into a nuclear war or a prolonged confrontation with conventional weapons as occurred during the Cold War, but on an even larger scale. The fascination with Nazi alternate histories in literature and history. The idea of a world dominated by the Axis powers is undoubtedly a topic that has captivated both historians and writers of historical fiction. In literature, especially alternate history, the narration of what could have happened if historical events had unfolded differently, has been used to explore the possible societies resulting from a Nazi victory. Works like The Man in the High Castle, 1962, by Philip K. Dick and Fatherland, 1992, by Robert Harris, present alternate universes where the Axis has prevailed. In both, totalitarian societies are described, where the Allies have been defeated, and they invite us to reflect on the consequences of a world under the rule of authoritarian regimes. Swastika Night, 1937, written by Catherine Burdekin, is one of the most unsettling and early works of this genre. Burdekin imagines a futuristic world, centuries after the Nazi victory, where Jews have been exterminated, Christianity has been marginalized, and Hitler is worshipped as an ancient god. This novel highlights the inherent contradictions in Nazi ideology and the racial tensions that would have eroded the system from within. The author anticipates the consequences of totalitarian policies, predicting a world ruled by German fascism, but consumed by its own excesses. In these works of fiction, German fascism is almost always self-destructive, riddled with internal contradictions, failed racial theories, and an inevitable erosion of its legitimacy. This forces us to reflect on the limits of totalitarianism and how total control over the lives of millions can ultimately be unsustainable. Fortunately, this nightmarish scenario was relegated to the realm of literary fiction, and the Allied victory prevented the world from falling under the yoke of Nazism. However, exploring these alternate universes offers valuable lessons about how wars can shape societies, cultures, and even the industries of the countries involved. The impact of a change in the outcome of World War II would have altered humanity in unimaginable ways, not only in terms of geopolitics but also in the social, economic, and cultural spheres. Although these analyses are speculative, they serve as a reminder of what could have been, prompting us to appreciate the peace and freedom we have attained in the present world. This type of reflection on history, although based on dark hypotheses, also invites us to consider the fundamental values we have defended since World War II: freedom, justice, and the rejection of authoritarianism. It is vital to understand how the decisions we make today can affect the future, and how wars have been a determining force in the fate of nations.